Now we know how we can generally build class-based components and how we can manage state and work with events there. But what about side effects? As I mentioned, you can't use these React hooks in class-based components, so you can't use useEffect. But class-based components have a concept called the component lifecycle. And of course, every component technically has a life cycle. It, for example, is rendered to the DOM or removed from the DOM. But there are specific methods you can add to class-based components to run code at different points in that life cycle. And the first, most important lifecycle method you can add to class-based components is the component did mount method. Like render, that's a built-in method which you can use as soon as you extend the built-in component which you import from React. And then you can add this method and React will call it for you when the component was just mounted, but more on that in a second. Other lifecycle methods you can add would be component did update and component will unmount. There are a couple of other less important lifecycle methods, which we'll not take a closer look at here, because these three lifecycle methods are by far the most important and common ones. Now, as I said, component did mount is called when a component is mounted, so when it was evaluated and now rendered to the DOM. It's basically the equivalent to using useEffect like this. You have your effect function, which I left out here with the three dots, and then you have the array of dependencies. And every effect function is executed when the component first is mounted. But if you have no dependencies, if you have an empty dependencies array, the effect function is only executed in that case. So adding useEffect with an empty dependency array is basically your equivalent to component did mount. And we're going to see component did mount in action in just a second. You also have component did update. This is called once a component was updated. So when something changed, when your state changed and the component was re-evaluated and re-rendered. This is basically your equivalent to useEffect with some dependencies. Whenever the dependencies change, the useEffect function re-executes. And the dependencies are re-evaluated when the component is re-evaluated and was rendered again. Because you learned that the effects are generally re-executed whenever a component re-rendered, if dependencies changed. So that's why this is basically your equivalent to component did update. Now component will unmount is called right before the component is removed from the DOM. And here the equivalent is basically the cleanup function from useEffect. That cleanup function is called right before the effect function is executed again, and also always again when the component is about to be removed from the DOM. Now again, let's take a closer look at that in action here. And for this, I altered the project slightly. Attached, you find the user finder component, which you can add to your components. And now we need to go to the users component, and there get rid of the dummy users here. And instead here, where we used the dummy users, refer to this props users. Because users are now passed in through props into this users component. And now we just need to go to the app component and use the user finder component and import user finder from components user finder instead of users. Also add the user finder.module.css file, which you also find attached. And if you added all of that and you save this, you should see an application that looks like this. And here, if you type, you now also filter this list down there with every keystroke. It's a very simple filter logic which I added here in the user finder. And the user finder component is a functional component using multiple state slices and useEffect to manage the users and to then filter the users and pass the filtered users to the users component. Now let's transform this component to a class-based component to get an idea on how these class-based components deal with side effects.